Hello there. If you're here, then perhaps you're ready to let your thoughts slow down, to rest, to drift, maybe even fall asleep, but not quite yet. Because before you do, I'd like to take you somewhere else for a little while. Not far, just far enough. Close your eyes if you like and imagine. You're stepping into a world where castle walls don't protect you. They imprison you. Where medieval fortresses aren't romantic refuges but suffocating prisons. Where the poor lived like rats in the walls. Welcome to medieval Europe, roughly 1000 to 1500 CE, where castles weren't fairy tale homes but brutal hierarchies of stone and suffering, where your social status determined whether you slept in silk or straw, whether you dined on venison or scraps, whether you lived in comfort or slowly died from neglect in the shadows of towering walls. This is a journey into the dark corners that Hollywood never shows you, into the servants' quarters where disease festered and hope died, into a world where magnificent architecture was built on the broken backs of people whose names history forgot. Medieval castle life for the poor wasn't about chivalry and romance. It was about surviving in a system designed to crush you while making the wealthy comfortable on your suffering. So before we begin, make sure to like this video if you enjoy learning about history's forgotten voices, and subscribe for more content that reveals the brutal reality behind romanticised medieval life. Hit that notification bell too, because we're constantly uploading new stories about the people history books ignore. Tonight, we're exploring the harsh reality of castle life for those who weren't born into privilege. Not the lords and ladies in their tapestried chambers, but the servants, workers, and peasants who made castle life possible through their daily suffering. You'll discover why castle walls were prisons for the poor, why medieval hospitality was a luxury only the wealthy enjoyed, and how the magnificent fortresses that still inspire us today were built on foundations of human misery. So settle in, let your mind wander back through the centuries, and prepare to understand why living in a medieval castle was truly, thoroughly, and completely brutal. Unless you were rich enough to avoid the reality that defined life for everyone else. Your position in the medieval castle hierarchy places you so far below the lord and his family that you might as well be another piece of furniture, useful when needed, invisible when not, and easily replaced if broken. You're living in a world where your entire existence serves the comfort and convenience of people who view you as barely human, where every moment of your day is controlled by others who consider your suffering irrelevant as long as their needs are met. The castle's social structure operates like a pyramid of oppression, with the lord and his family occupying the comfortable apex, while you exist in the crushing foundation, bearing the weight of everyone above you while receiving none of the benefits that your labour creates. Your daily life revolves around serving people who live in luxury that your work makes possible, but who would sooner notice a missing piece of furniture than acknowledge your individual humanity. Your sleeping quarters occupy the worst possible locations within the castle. Damp basements, cramped attics, or corners of work areas where you bed down among the tools and supplies that define your servitude. The space allocated for your rest is calculated to provide the minimum area necessary to maintain your ability to work, with no consideration for comfort, privacy, or basic human dignity. You share these miserable accommodations with other servants, creating overcrowded conditions where disease spreads rapidly and personal space becomes a luxury you can't afford. The straw pallet that serves as your bed provides minimal cushioning against the cold stone floors, while harbouring fleas, lice, and other vermin that make sleep a constant battle against biting insects. Your bedding consists of whatever rags and scraps you can accumulate, often sharing blankets with other servants, while shivering through nights when the castle's heating systems warm only the rooms occupied by your social superiors. The dampness that permeates your sleeping area creates rheumatic conditions that will cripple you before middle age, while the poor ventilation exposes you to respiratory diseases that kill servants regularly. Your daily schedule begins before dawn and extends long after dark, creating a work routine that consumes nearly every waking hour, while leaving you exhausted and depleted at the end of each day. The tasks assigned to you include the most physically demanding and dangerous work in the castle, from hauling water up multiple flights of stairs to cleaning waste from latrines, all performed without adequate tools or safety equipment that might make your work easier or less hazardous. The food allocated to you represents the castle's leftovers and scraps, carefully calculated to provide the minimum nutrition necessary to maintain your work capacity without wasting resources on servant comfort. Your meals consist of coarse bread, thin gruel, and whatever vegetables are too wilted or damaged for the Lord's table, supplemented occasionally with small amounts of salted meat that may be spoiled but still considered adequate for servant consumption. The quantity and quality of your food reflects your position in the castle hierarchy, marking you as someone whose nutritional needs are less important than those of the livestock. Your clothing consists of rough, undyed woolens that mark your servant status while providing minimal protection against the cold and damp conditions that characterize your working environment. The garments issued to you are designed for durability rather than comfort, made from the coarsest materials available and cut in simple patterns that require minimal tailoring expense. Your shoes, if provided at all, are crude leather constructions that offer little protection against the stone floors and harsh conditions of castle work, often requiring you to work barefoot when footwear becomes too damaged to provide any benefit. The tools and equipment provided for your work are primitive and often broken, requiring you to accomplish complex tasks with inadequate instruments, while being held responsible for any failures or delays in completing your assignments. The castle's investment in servant tools reflects their view of your expendability. Why provide quality equipment for workers who can be easily replaced if injured or killed by dangerous working conditions? Your legal status within the castle community grants you no protections or rights, leaving you vulnerable to punishment, abuse, or dismissal based on the whims of your superiors without recourse to any system of justice or appeal. The feudal legal system that governs castle life treats servants as property rather than people, creating conditions where physical punishment, sexual exploitation, and economic abuse become normal aspects of servant existence that must be endured without complaint. The social interactions permitted to you are strictly regulated by your position in the castle hierarchy, limiting your contact with upper-class residents while controlling your relationships with fellow servants through rules designed to prevent organisation or collective action that might challenge the established order. Your conversations with castle nobility are restricted to responses to direct orders, while social relationships with other servants are monitored and controlled to prevent the development of solidarity that could threaten castle authority. The punishment systems that maintain castle discipline fall most heavily on servants and workers, creating an environment of fear and intimidation, where minor infractions can result in severe physical punishment, reduction in already inadequate food rations, or expulsion from the castle that may amount to a death sentence for individuals with no other means of survival. The arbitrary nature of castle justice means that your fate depends entirely on the mood and preferences of your superiors, creating psychological stress that compounds the physical hardships of servant life. Your life expectancy as a castle servant is significantly lower than that of the nobility you serve, reflecting the dangerous working conditions, inadequate nutrition, and lack of medical care that characterize servant existence. The castle's attitude towards servant mortality treats your death as an inconvenience that requires finding replacement labour rather than a human tragedy worthy of grief or commemoration. Your individual life has value only insofar as it contributes to castle operations, making you easily disposable when injury, illness, or age reduces your productive capacity. The opportunities for advancement within the castle hierarchy are virtually non-existent for people in your position, creating a system where birth determines destiny, and personal merit or effort cannot overcome the social barriers that separate servants from their superiors. The rigid class structure that governs castle life ensures that you will spend your entire existence serving people who view you as inherently inferior, regardless of your intelligence, skills, or character. Your daily routine as a castle servant begins hours before sunrise, when you must rise in the cold darkness to begin preparations for your superior's comfort, working by flickering candlelight or oil lamps that provide barely adequate illumination, while creating fire hazards in your workspace. The pre-dawn hours require you to perform essential tasks including lighting fires, drawing water, and preparing breakfast while your muscles ache from yesterday's labour and your body cries out for the sleep you're denied. The morning's first task involves rekindling the fires that provide heat and cooking capability throughout the castle, requiring you to carry heavy loads of wood and coal up multiple flights of stairs while breathing the smoke and ash that will gradually destroy your lungs over years of service. Fire maintenance becomes a constant responsibility that cannot be neglected, as extinguished fires mean cold rooms and angry superiors who will punish you severely for failing to maintain their comfort. Water hauling represents one of your most physically demanding daily responsibilities, requiring you to carry heavy buckets from wells or streams to every area of the castle that requires water for drinking, cooking, cleaning or washing. The weight of water-filled containers strains your back and shoulders, while the constant trips up and down castle stairs wear away your joints and create chronic pain that will plague you throughout your shortened life. The quantity of water required for castle operations means that water hauling occupies hours of your day while providing no rest or variation in the monotonous physical labour. Kitchen preparation begins before dawn as you assist in preparing meals for the castle's residents, working in smoky, overheated conditions while handling sharp knives and dealing with open flames that create constant risks of cuts, burns, and fires. Your kitchen duties include the most unpleasant tasks such as butchering animals, cleaning fish, and preparing ingredients, while senior kitchen staff focus on cooking and presentation tasks that require greater skill and carry more prestige. The cleaning responsibilities assigned to you include scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, and maintaining latrines in conditions that expose you to human waste and the diseases that thrive in unsanitary environments. Your cleaning duties require you to handle the bodily waste of your superiors while using primitive tools and harsh chemicals that damage your skin and respiratory system. The nature of cleaning work marks you as someone whose social position requires handling the filth that castle nobility generates but refuses to deal with personally. Laundry work involves washing clothes and linens in cold water, using harsh soaps that strip the skin from your hands, while the constant moisture and chemical exposure create chronic health problems, including respiratory ailments and skin conditions. The laundry process requires you to carry wet linens and clothing to drying areas, often outdoors in harsh weather conditions that expose you to additional health risks, while accomplishing tasks that your superiors consider essential but beneath their dignity. Meal service requires you to carry heavy trays and serve food to castle residents, while maintaining a subservient demeanour that acknowledges your inferior social position. Your serving duties expose you to the conversations and behaviours of your superiors, while requiring you to remain invisible and silent unless directly addressed. The serving process involves constant standing and movement, while carrying heavy loads, creating foot and leg problems that worsen over years of service. Stable work involves caring for the horses and other livestock that support castle operations, requiring you to muck stalls, carry feed, and maintain equipment in conditions that expose you to animal waste and the injuries that result from handling large, potentially dangerous animals. Your stable duties often require working outdoors in harsh weather, while handling tools and equipment that can cause serious injuries when used by exhausted workers under poor lighting conditions. Maintenance tasks throughout the castle require you to repair and clean areas that suffer constant wear and damage, working with primitive tools while attempting to maintain stone structures that require specialised knowledge and skills that you're expected to develop without proper training or supervision. Your maintenance responsibilities include dangerous tasks such as cleaning high windows, repairing roof damage, and working with heavy stone blocks that can cause serious injuries or death when handled improperly. Evening duties extend your workday long after sunset as you prepare evening meals, maintain fires, and clean up after the day's activities, while your exhausted body struggles to continue functioning after 12 or more hours of physical labour. The evening hours require you to work by inadequate lighting, while performing tasks that require attention and care, despite your fatigue and the poor working conditions that make accidents more likely. Night duties may require you to maintain fires, guard entrances, or respond to emergencies that occur during sleeping hours, preventing you from getting adequate rest while adding security responsibilities to your already overwhelming workload. The night watch assignments rotate among servants, ensuring that someone is always available to serve the castle's needs, while denying servants the continuous sleep necessary for physical recovery and mental health. The weekly schedule includes additional duties such as deep cleaning, laundry processing, and maintenance projects that require extended periods of intensive labour beyond your normal daily responsibilities. These weekly tasks often involve moving heavy furniture, scrubbing large areas, or performing seasonal maintenance that requires physical exertion that exceeds your normal work demands while providing no additional compensation or time for recovery. Seasonal responsibilities add periodic duties including food preservation, winter preparations and festival support that require extended work hours during specific times of year when castle operations expand beyond normal requirements. Your seasonal duties may include working outdoors in extreme weather conditions, while performing tasks that are essential for castle survival, but particularly demanding on servant health and endurance. Holiday and feast preparations require you to work extended hours while maintaining the elaborate celebrations that demonstrate your superior's wealth and status, but from which you receive no benefits beyond the privilege of working harder to create entertainment for others. The feast preparations involve days of intensive cooking, cleaning and serving, while you subsist on your normal inadequate rations, despite the additional physical demands placed on your already depleted body. Emergency duties require you to respond immediately to castle crises including fires, attacks, or medical emergencies, while abandoning your normal responsibilities to address urgent situations that may place you in physical danger. The emergency response expectations treat servants as expendable resources whose lives can be risked to protect castle property and nobility, while providing no additional compensation or recognition for the dangers you face. The rest periods permitted during your daily schedule are minimal and often interrupted by urgent tasks that require immediate attention, regardless of your physical condition or need for recovery time. Your breaks from work are calculated to provide just enough recovery to maintain your productivity, while preventing the rest and recuperation that would enable you to maintain long-term health and well-being. Meal breaks allow you to consume your inadequate rations while often requiring you to continue working or remain available for immediate recall when your services are needed. The eating arrangements for servants provide no comfortable seating or pleasant environment, often requiring you to eat while standing or sitting on hard surfaces, in areas designated for food storage rather than dining. The sleep schedule permitted to servants provides minimal hours for rest, while requiring you to sleep in uncomfortable conditions that prevent the deep restorative sleep necessary for physical and mental health. Your sleeping hours are subject to interruption for emergency duties, while the poor sleeping conditions ensure that you never feel fully rested or recovered from the previous day's exhaustion. Your sleeping arrangements as a castle servant confine you to spaces that would be considered inhumane by modern prison standards. Cramped areas where multiple people share quarters originally designed for storage rather than human habitation. The rooms allocated to servants represent the least desirable spaces within the castle, areas that are too cold, too damp, too dark, or too dangerous for occupation by anyone whose comfort matters to castle management. The servant dormitories occupy basement areas, where moisture seeps through stone walls, creating perpetually damp conditions that promote mould growth and respiratory diseases, while providing no adequate heating to offset the cold that rises from the earth below. These underground spaces lack windows or proper ventilation, creating air quality so poor that simply breathing becomes a health hazard, while the darkness requires you to navigate by feel when candles are not provided or permitted. Your sleeping space consists of a straw pallet placed directly on cold stone floors that conduct heat away from your body throughout the night, ensuring that you remain cold regardless of whatever inadequate coverings you can accumulate. The straw filling in your mattress harbours fleas, lice, bed bugs, and other parasites that feed on your blood while you sleep, creating constant itching and irritation that prevents restful sleep while transmitting diseases that can prove fatal. The shared sleeping arrangements require you to occupy dormitory-style rooms with numerous other servants, eliminating any possibility of privacy, while creating overcrowded conditions where personal space becomes non-existent and conflicts between exhausted workers become inevitable. The proximity to other sleepers means constant exposure to their illnesses, snoring, movement, and personal hygiene problems, while providing no escape from interpersonal tensions that develop among people forced to live in stressful conditions. Your personal possessions must be stored in whatever space you can claim around your sleeping area, often requiring you to use your clothing as pillows while keeping your few belongings in cloth bundles that provide no security against theft by desperate fellow servants. The absence of personal storage space means that you cannot accumulate possessions beyond the most essential items, while anything of value becomes vulnerable to theft by people whose desperation may exceed their honesty. The heating systems that warm the castle's important areas do not extend to servant quarters, leaving you dependent on shared body heat and whatever blankets you can obtain through castle allocation or personal effort. The cold in servant areas becomes so severe during winter months that ice may form on indoor surfaces, while your breathing creates visible vapour clouds that demonstrate the freezing conditions you must endure while attempting to sleep. Lighting in servant quarters consists of whatever candles or oil lamps you can obtain through official allocation or personal resources, but these illumination sources are often prohibited due to fire risks in overcrowded areas, filled with flammable straw bedding and wooden structures. The darkness that characterises servant living spaces makes it difficult to navigate safely, while preventing you from engaging in any personal activities during the limited time when you're not working. The ventilation systems that provide fresh air to castle nobility do not reach servant quarters, creating stale, polluted air conditions where the breath and body odours of multiple occupants combine with moisture and mould to produce air quality that damages lung function over time. The poor air circulation means that smoke from cooking and heating fires drifts into servant areas where it accumulates and creates respiratory problems that shorten servant lifespans significantly. Sanitation facilities available to servants consist of shared latrines that are rarely cleaned and often overflowing, creating unsanitary conditions that spread intestinal diseases and parasites throughout servant populations. The waste disposal systems that serve servant areas are primitive and inadequate, often requiring you to dispose of human waste in areas that contaminate water supplies or living spaces. Water access for personal hygiene requires you to carry water from distant sources to your living areas, but the demands of your work schedule often prevent adequate attention to personal cleanliness, while the lack of privacy makes washing and bathing difficult or impossible. The water available for servant use is often contaminated or limited in quantity, forcing you to choose between drinking water and washing while often having inadequate supplies for either purpose. Privacy becomes impossible in servant quarters, where multiple people share spaces designed for far fewer occupants, while the lack of partitions or separate areas means that personal activities including dressing, washing and sleeping occur under constant observation by others. The absence of privacy creates psychological stress, while preventing the personal space necessary for mental health and emotional recovery from daily stresses. Security for personal possessions and personal safety becomes problematic in overcrowded servant quarters, where theft and violence may occur, while castle authorities show little interest in resolving conflicts between servants whose welfare is considered unimportant. The lack of secure storage and the desperation of fellow servants creates an environment where personal possessions may be stolen, while physical safety depends on your ability to defend yourself against people driven to desperation by their circumstances. Noise control becomes impossible in crowded servant quarters, where snoring, coughing, movement, and conversations create constant disturbance that prevents restful sleep, while adding to the stress and exhaustion that characterize servant life. The noise from adjacent work areas, castle activities, and other servant quarters creates a constant din that makes it difficult to rest, even during the limited hours when sleep is permitted. Pest control in servant areas receives no attention from castle management, allowing rats, mice, fleas, lice, and other vermin to multiply unchecked, while feeding on food scraps and human blood. The vermin infestations in servant quarters create additional health hazards, while making already uncomfortable living conditions even more unpleasant through constant exposure to biting insects and disease-carrying rodents. Temperature regulation in servant quarters depends entirely on outside weather and shared body heat, creating living conditions that range from freezing cold in winter to stifling heat in summer, while providing no relief from either extreme. The stone construction that keeps castle nobility comfortable creates thermal mass that makes servant quarters colder in winter and hotter in summer than outdoor conditions. Air quality in servant quarters deteriorates due to poor ventilation, multiple occupants, and proximity to work areas that generate smoke, dust, and chemical fumes that damage respiratory health over time. The polluted air in servant living spaces contributes to chronic coughing, lung disease, and reduced life expectancy, while providing no relief from the toxic environment that characterises servant existence. Structural integrity in servant quarters often receives minimal maintenance attention, creating living conditions where walls may be cracked, roofs may leak, and floors may be uneven or damaged while repairs are deferred in favour of maintaining areas occupied by castle nobility. The deteriorating condition of servant quarters creates additional safety hazards, while making already unpleasant living conditions even more uncomfortable and dangerous. Fire safety in servant quarters becomes a constant concern due to overcrowded conditions, flammable materials, and the use of open flames for heating and lighting, while emergency exits may be blocked or inadequate for rapid evacuation. The fire risks in servant areas are increased by poor construction and maintenance, while fire suppression resources are allocated primarily to protecting areas occupied by valuable people and possessions. Health hazards in servant quarters include exposure to mould, dampness, poor air quality, contaminated water, and inadequate sanitation, while medical care for servants remains unavailable or minimal when health problems develop. The cumulative health effects of living in substandard conditions ensure that servants develop chronic illnesses that reduce their life expectancy while making their daily work more difficult and painful. Your nutrition as a castle servant consists of whatever food remains after feeding the castle's important residents, creating a diet so inadequate that malnutrition becomes your normal condition, while hunger remains a constant companion throughout your shortened life. The food allocation system within the castle operates on strict hierarchical principles, where the quality and quantity of food you receive reflects your social worthlessness rather than your nutritional needs or work demands. The bread distributed to servants represents the coarsest, darkest loaves made from inferior grains that may include sawdust, chalk, or other adulterants designed to extend the flour supply while reducing costs. Your daily bread allocation provides barely adequate calories while lacking the nutritional quality necessary to maintain health during the physically demanding work that defines servant life. The bread often becomes mouldy or infested with weevils before consumption, but servant food standards permit consumption of contaminated food that would be discarded if intended for noble consumption. Meat appears in servant meals only as scraps and leftovers from noble tables, often consisting of gristle, bones, and portions that have spoiled beyond acceptability for upper-class consumption. The meat provided to servants may be diseased, rotten, or contaminated while still being considered adequate nutrition for people whose health matters little to castle management. The small quantities of meat in servant diets provide insufficient protein for maintaining muscle mass and strength during heavy physical labour. Vegetables allocated to servants consist of wilted, damaged, or spoiled produce that cannot be served to castle nobility, while often lacking the nutritional value necessary for maintaining health. Your vegetable rations may include roots and leaves that are barely edible, while excluding the fresh, high-quality produce that maintains the health of your social superiors. The limited variety and poor quality of servant vegetables creates nutritional deficiencies that lead to diseases including scurvy and other conditions that could be prevented by adequate diet. Dairy products rarely appear in servant meals except as sour milk or spoiled cheese that would be thrown away if not fed to servants whose digestive problems from consuming contaminated dairy are considered unimportant. The limited dairy in servant diets provides inadequate calcium and protein, while often causing illness from bacterial contamination that affects productivity but receives no medical attention. Beverage options for servants consist primarily of weak ale or contaminated water that may carry diseases while providing inadequate hydration for people engaged in physical labour in hot, demanding conditions. The quality of servant beverages reflects their social position, while creating additional health risks through consumption of liquids that would be considered unsafe for noble consumption. Meal timing for servants accommodates the needs of castle operations rather than servant welfare, often requiring you to eat quickly during brief breaks from work while standing or sitting in uncomfortable conditions that interfere with proper digestion. Your meal schedule depends on the completion of work tasks rather than normal hunger cycles, creating irregular eating patterns that worsen the effects of inadequate nutrition on your health and energy levels. Food preparation for servants involves minimal cooking and seasoning while focusing on speed and cost reduction rather than palatability or nutritional value. The servant meals lack the spices, herbs, and cooking techniques that make noble food appetizing, while often being served cold or partially cooked due to time constraints and lack of attention to servant comfort. Portion sizes for servant meals are calculated to provide the minimum nutrition necessary to maintain work capacity, while avoiding waste on people whose well-being is considered unimportant to castle operations. Your food portions provide insufficient calories for the physical demands of servant work, while creating chronic hunger that weakens your immune system and reduces your ability to resist disease and injury. Eating conditions for servants require you to consume meals in areas designated for food storage or work, rather than comfortable dining spaces, often eating while standing or sitting on hard surfaces without proper utensils or comfortable seating. The eating environment for servants provides no pleasant social interaction or relaxation, while meal times become brief interruptions in work rather than opportunities for nourishment and rest. Food storage for servant rations occurs in areas where contamination and spoilage are common, while preservation methods focus on preventing total loss rather than maintaining food quality that would ensure servant health. The servant food storage areas may harbour rodents and insects that contaminate food supplies, while creating additional health risks from consuming food that has been exposed to pest infestations. Seasonal variations in servant food quality create periods when nutrition becomes even more inadequate, while winter months may bring near-starvation conditions as preserved foods spoil or become depleted before spring harvests provide fresh supplies. The seasonal food shortages affect servants more severely than castle nobility, while creating health crises that may prove fatal for weakened servants who lack the reserves to survive periods of extreme scarcity. Food-related diseases become common among servant populations due to consumption of contaminated, spoiled, or nutritionally inadequate food, while medical treatment for food poisoning and malnutrition remains unavailable or minimal. The digestive problems that result from servant diet create chronic illness that interferes with work performance while receiving no attention from castle medical resources that focus on maintaining noble health. Nutritional deficiencies develop quickly on servant diets that lack essential vitamins, minerals, and proteins, while creating health problems including anemia, rickets, scurvy, and other diseases that could be prevented by adequate nutrition. The deficiency diseases that affect servants create visible signs of malnutrition, while reducing life expectancy and work capacity in ways that castle management considers acceptable costs of maintaining servant labour forces. Hunger becomes a constant experience for servants whose food allocation provides insufficient nutrition, while the psychological effects of chronic hunger include depression, irritability, and reduced mental function that interfere with work performance and personal relationships. The persistent hunger experienced by servants creates obsessive thoughts about food, while making concentration on work tasks more difficult, despite the punishment that results from poor performance. Food competition among servants creates social tensions when inadequate food supplies force servants to compete for scarce nutrition, while desperation may drive some individuals to steal food from fellow servants who are equally malnourished. The competition for food among servants creates conflicts that divide servant populations, while preventing the solidarity that might enable collective action to improve servant conditions. Your exposure to disease as a castle servant occurs constantly through the dangerous working conditions, contaminated living spaces, and lack of medical care that characterize your existence at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The disease environment in servant areas creates conditions where infection spreads rapidly, while your weakened physical condition from malnutrition and exhaustion makes you vulnerable to illnesses that would be manageable for healthier individuals. Respiratory diseases flourish in the poorly ventilated servant quarters, where multiple people share contaminated air, while your work in dusty, smoky environments damages your lungs and creates chronic breathing problems that worsen over time. The constant exposure to smoke from fires, dust from cleaning, and poor air quality in living areas creates respiratory conditions that make physical labour increasingly difficult, while receiving no medical attention from castle health resources. Intestinal diseases spread rapidly through servant populations due to contaminated food and water supplies, while poor sanitation in servant areas creates ideal conditions for parasites and bacterial infections that cause chronic diarrhoea, malnutrition, and dehydration. The intestinal problems that affect servants create additional nutritional deficiencies, while interfering with the absorption of whatever inadequate nutrition is provided through servant food allocations. Skin conditions develop from constant exposure to harsh chemicals used in cleaning, while poor personal hygiene due to limited water access creates infections and rashes that make physical work more painful and difficult. The skin problems that affect servants often become infected due to lack of medical care, while creating visible signs of disease that mark servants as unhealthy and potentially contagious. Parasitic infestations, including lice, fleas, bed bugs, and intestinal worms, become endemic among servant populations, while the overcrowded living conditions ensure rapid transmission of parasites throughout servant communities. The parasite infestations create constant discomfort, while contributing to malnutrition and disease transmission that weakens servants and reduces their life expectancy. Injuries from dangerous work occur frequently among servants who handle sharp tools, work with heavy materials, and perform tasks in dangerous conditions without adequate safety equipment or training. The cuts, burns, bruises, and broken bones that result from servant work often become infected due to poor wound care, while healing is complicated by continued work demands and inadequate nutrition that prevents proper recovery. Joint and muscle problems develop early among servants due to the repetitive physical labour and heavy lifting that characterises servant work, while poor nutrition prevents proper muscle development and recovery. The arthritis, back problems, and joint damage that affect servants create chronic pain that makes work more difficult while reducing mobility and quality of life without access to pain relief or treatment. Medical care for servants ranges from minimal to non-existent, while the castle's medical resources focus on maintaining the health of valuable individuals whose lives matter to castle operations. The absence of medical attention for servant health problems means that minor conditions often develop into serious illnesses, while treatable diseases become fatal due to lack of care and intervention. Workplace injuries among servants receive minimal attention, while serious accidents that disable servants may result in dismissal from castle service rather than medical treatment and recovery support. The dangerous nature of servant work creates frequent injuries, while the lack of safety equipment and training ensures that accidents occur regularly, with consequences that servants must endure without adequate medical care. Epidemic diseases spread rapidly through servant quarters, while quarantine measures focus on protecting castle nobility rather than preventing disease transmission among servant populations. The crowded living conditions and poor sanitation in servant areas create ideal conditions for epidemic diseases, while servants receive no protection or treatment when outbreaks occur. Occupational diseases develop among servants due to exposure to toxic materials and dangerous working conditions, while the long-term health effects of servant work are ignored by castle management, whose concern focuses on immediate productivity rather than worker longevity. The chronic health problems that result from servant occupations often become disabling while receiving no compensation or support from castle authorities. Mental health problems among servants result from the stress, abuse, and hopelessness that characterise servant life, while emotional and psychological disorders receive no recognition or treatment from medical authorities who focus exclusively on physical health among valuable individuals. The depression, anxiety, and despair that affect servants interfere with work performance, while creating additional suffering that remains invisible to castle management. Life expectancy for servants remains significantly lower than for castle nobility, while the accumulated effects of poor nutrition, dangerous work, disease exposure, and lack of medical care ensure that servants die young from preventable causes. The shortened lifespan of servants creates constant turnover in servant populations, while individual servant deaths are viewed as inconvenient but inevitable aspects of castle operations. Reproductive health among female servants suffers due to malnutrition, physical stress, and lack of medical care, while pregnancy and childbirth occur without adequate support or safety measures that could prevent maternal and infant mortality. The reproductive problems that affect servant women create additional health risks, while pregnant servants continue working under dangerous conditions that threaten both maternal and fetal health. Dental health among servants deteriorates rapidly due to poor nutrition and lack of dental care, while tooth problems create additional pain and eating difficulties that worsen malnutrition and overall health. The dental problems that affect servants often become infected while creating chronic pain that interferes with eating and work performance without access to dental treatment. Preventive healthcare for servants does not exist, while measures that could prevent disease and maintain health are not provided to servant populations whose well-being is considered unimportant to castle operations. The absence of preventive care ensures that servant health problems develop and worsen, while early intervention that could maintain servant productivity is not considered worth the investment. Death among servants occurs frequently and receives minimal attention, while servant mortality is viewed as a normal aspect of castle operations that requires replacement workers rather than investigation into preventable causes. The frequent deaths among servant populations create constant grief and trauma for surviving servants, while demonstrating the expendable nature of servant lives in the castle hierarchy. Your vulnerability to violence and abuse as a castle servant stems from your complete lack of legal protection and social status in a system that grants absolute authority to your superiors while providing you with no recourse for mistreatment or injustice. The power structure within medieval castles creates conditions where physical punishment, sexual exploitation, and psychological abuse become normalized aspects of servant life that must be endured without complaint or resistance. Physical punishment for servants ranges from casual violence for minor infractions to severe beatings that may cause permanent injury or death, while the arbitrary nature of castle discipline means that your treatment depends entirely on the mood and preferences of whoever holds power over you at any given moment. The normalization of violence against servants creates an environment of fear where you must anticipate punishment for real or imagined offences while having no protection against the whims of violent superiors. Sexual exploitation of servants, particularly female servants, occurs regularly within castle walls, where the combination of absolute power and lack of legal protection creates conditions where sexual assault becomes a routine hazard of servant life. The sexual abuse that servants endure receives no legal recognition or punishment, while resistance to sexual exploitation may result in violent retaliation or dismissal from castle service that amounts to a death sentence for individuals with no alternative means of survival. Psychological abuse through constant humiliation, threats, and degradation becomes a daily reality for servants whose humanity is denied by superiors who view them as objects rather than people deserving of basic respect and dignity. The psychological warfare that servants endure includes verbal abuse, public humiliation, and threats of violence that create mental health problems while destroying self-esteem and hope for better treatment. Workplace violence occurs regularly in castle environments where dangerous working conditions are compounded by supervisors who use physical force to motivate servant productivity, while showing no concern for servant safety or well-being. The violence that accompanies servant work includes beatings for poor performance, punishment for accidents, and physical abuse that is justified as necessary discipline for maintaining castle operations. Legal recourse for servant grievances does not exist within medieval legal systems that grant absolute authority to feudal lords while providing no protection or representation for servants who suffer abuse at the hands of their superiors. The absence of legal protection means that servants must endure whatever treatment they receive while having no avenue for seeking justice or compensation for injuries suffered through abuse and mistreatment. Reporting abuse becomes impossible for servants who lack access to legal authorities, while any attempt to complain about mistreatment may result in additional punishment for insubordination or disloyalty to castle authority. The isolation that characterises servant life within castle walls prevents outside intervention while creating conditions where abuse can continue indefinitely without detection or consequence for perpetrators. Witnessing violence against fellow servants creates additional psychological trauma, while the requirement to remain silent about abuse you observe adds complicity to your survival strategy, forcing you to choose between self-preservation and moral action in situations where intervention could result in your own punishment or death. The constant exposure to violence against others creates desensitization to brutality, while building resentment and fear that affect your mental health and relationships with fellow servants. Self-defense becomes impossible for servants who are forbidden from possessing weapons or fighting back against their attackers, while any resistance to violence may be interpreted as rebellion against lawful authority that justifies even more severe punishment. The prohibition against servant self-defense creates conditions where abuse can escalate without consequence, while victims must submit to whatever violence their superiors choose to inflict. Group punishment affects servant communities when individual infractions result in collective punishment that creates tension and resentment among servants who suffer for the actions of others. The use of group punishment as a control mechanism divides servant communities, while preventing solidarity that might enable resistance to abusive treatment by castle authorities. Medical care for injuries resulting from abuse remains unavailable, while servants who are injured through violence must continue working despite their injuries or face additional punishment for failing to maintain productivity. The denial of medical care for abuse-related injuries ensures that physical damage from violence becomes permanent while creating additional suffering that serves as ongoing punishment for perceived infractions. Documentation of abuse does not occur while the illiteracy of most servants and the secrecy surrounding castle operations ensures that evidence of systematic mistreatment remains hidden from outside authorities who might have power to intervene. The absence of records about servant abuse allows brutality to continue without accountability, while creating conditions where patterns of violence remain invisible to potential reformers. Escape from abusive situations becomes impossible for servants who are bound to castle service through legal obligations, while lacking resources or destinations that would enable them to survive outside castle walls. The economic dependence that characterises servant relationships with castle authorities creates conditions where escape from abuse may result in starvation or death. While making endurance of mistreatment seem like the only viable survival option, your working conditions as a castle servant involve physical demands that exceed human endurance capabilities, while operating in environments so dangerous that injury and death become routine occupational hazards rather than preventable accidents. The nature of servant work requires you to perform tasks that would challenge healthy, well-fed individuals, while you operate under conditions of malnutrition, exhaustion, and equipment failure that make dangerous work even more hazardous. Heavy lifting requirements force you to move stone blocks, water containers, furniture, and supplies that weigh more than your malnourished body can safely handle, while the absence of mechanical aids or proper lifting techniques ensures that back injuries, muscle damage, and joint problems develop early in your service. The daily lifting demands create cumulative damage to your spine and joints, while the pressure to maintain productivity prevents adequate recovery time that might allow healing between work sessions. Repetitive motion tasks, including scrubbing, carrying, grinding, and cleaning, create overuse injuries that develop into permanent disability, while the monotonous nature of servant work ensures that you perform the same damaging motions thousands of times daily without variation or rest. The repetitive stress that characterises servant work causes joint inflammation, muscle damage, and nerve compression that gradually reduce your physical capabilities while creating chronic pain that interferes with sleep and daily functioning. Dangerous tool operation requires you to work with sharp knives, heavy hammers, and primitive equipment that can cause severe injuries when handled by exhausted workers in poor lighting conditions. The tools provided for servant use are often damaged, dull, or inadequately maintained, while the pressure to complete tasks quickly increases accident risks that result in cuts, punctures, and crush injuries that receive minimal medical attention. Chemical exposure from cleaning agents, food preparation materials and castle maintenance substances creates respiratory problems, skin damage, and poisoning effects that accumulate over time, while protective equipment remains unavailable to servants whose health is considered expendable. The toxic chemicals used in castle operations include substances that damage lungs, burn skin, and cause organ failure while servants work with these materials daily without protection or safety training. Fire hazards permeate servant work environments where open flames provide lighting and heating, while flammable materials create constant risks of burns and fatal fires that could trap servants in areas with inadequate escape routes. The fire dangers that servants face include working near open hearths, carrying burning materials, and maintaining heating systems that can cause severe burns while working in buildings designed without consideration for servant safety. Height-related dangers require servants to work on ladders, scaffolding, and elevated surfaces without safety equipment, while performing tasks that require balance and coordination, despite fatigue and malnutrition that affect physical capabilities. The full risks that servants encounter include cleaning high windows, repairing roof damage, and accessing storage areas at dangerous heights while lacking the safety equipment that might prevent fatal falls. Water-related hazards include drowning risks from cleaning wells, working near water sources, and performing laundry tasks in conditions where exhausted workers may lose consciousness and fall into water that proves fatal. The water dangers that affect servants also include hypothermia from working with cold water during winter months, while lacking adequate clothing or heating to prevent dangerous body temperature drops. Animal-related dangers require servants to work with horses, cattle, and other livestock that can cause serious injuries through kicks, bites, and crushing, while servant responsibilities include handling frightened or aggressive animals without adequate training or protective equipment. The animal hazards that servants face include being trampled by large animals, attacked by aggressive livestock, and injured by animals that are themselves stressed and dangerous due to poor treatment and overcrowding. Structural hazards within castle buildings include working in areas with unstable construction, crumbling stonework, and inadequate maintenance, while servants must perform tasks in spaces that may collapse or create falling debris that causes serious injuries. The structural dangers that servants encounter include working in damaged buildings, moving through areas with weak floors, and performing maintenance tasks that may trigger structural failures. Lifting-related injuries become inevitable when servants must move objects that exceed safe lifting limits, while working alone in tasks that require multiple people, but are assigned to individuals to reduce labour costs. The lifting injuries that affect servants include hernias, back damage, and joint injuries that create permanent disability, while forcing servants to continue working despite pain and reduced physical capabilities. Time pressure creates additional workplace dangers when servants must complete tasks within unrealistic timeframes, while exhaustion and speed requirements increase accident risks that result in injuries and mistakes. The time pressures that characterise servant work create conditions where safety considerations are abandoned in favour of productivity, while servants face punishment for accidents that result from dangerous working conditions imposed by castle management. Equipment failure creates workplace hazards when servants must use broken, damaged, or inadequate tools, while makeshift repairs and improvised solutions increase injury risks that could be prevented by proper equipment maintenance. The equipment problems that affect servant work include using dull blades that require excessive force, working with broken handles that cause loss of control, and operating damaged machinery that creates unpredictable hazards. Environmental hazards include working in extreme temperatures, poor ventilation, and toxic atmospheres, while servants lack protective clothing or breathing equipment that might reduce health risks from environmental exposure. The environmental dangers that servants face include heat exhaustion from kitchen work, respiratory damage from dusty conditions, and hypothermia from outdoor work during extreme weather. Workload distribution ensures that servants carry responsibilities that exceed individual capabilities, while the shortage of servant labour means that essential tasks must be completed regardless of worker availability or physical condition. The excessive workloads that servants bear create conditions where exhaustion becomes chronic, while impossible task demands ensure that servants fail to meet expectations despite maximum effort. Rest periods remain inadequate for recovery from physical demands, while break times are often interrupted by urgent tasks that prevent the recuperation necessary for maintaining health and work capacity. The insufficient rest that characterises servant schedules creates cumulative fatigue, while preventing the physical recovery necessary for safe work performance and long-term health maintenance. Your social position as a castle servant places you in a state of enforced invisibility, where your presence is acknowledged only when your services are needed, while your individual humanity remains unrecognised by the social superiors who control every aspect of your existence. The social isolation that defines servant life creates psychological damage while preventing the human connections that are essential for mental health and emotional survival in harsh conditions. Class barriers within castle society create impermeable social divisions that prevent meaningful interaction between servants and their superiors, while maintaining rigid hierarchies that deny servants access to social activities, cultural events, and community participation that define normal human social experience. The class segregation that governs castle life ensures that servants remain excluded from the social relationships that provide meaning and support to other castle residents. Communication restrictions limit servant interactions with castle nobility to functional exchanges necessary for work completion, while prohibiting the casual conversation, social discussion, and personal interaction that characterize normal human relationships. The communication barriers that separate servants from their superiors create conditions where servants become invisible as individuals, while being reduced to their functional roles in castle operations. Social activities within the castle exclude servants from participation, while entertainment, celebrations, and community gatherings remain privileges reserved for individuals whose social status grants them access to leisure and enjoyment that servants provide through their labour but cannot share. The social exclusion that characterises servant life prevents access to music, dancing, storytelling, and other activities that provide emotional relief and cultural enrichment. Religious participation for servants may be restricted or segregated, while access to spiritual comfort and community worship depends on the policies of castle authorities, who may view servant spiritual needs as unimportant compared to maintaining work productivity. The religious isolation that affects servants may deny access to sacraments, spiritual counselling, and religious community that provide comfort and hope during difficult circumstances. Family relationships become strained or impossible when servant obligations prevent normal family interaction, while the demands of castle service may require separation from spouse and children for extended periods that damage family bonds and prevent normal family functioning. The family disruption that results from servant obligations creates additional emotional stress while preventing the family support that might help individuals cope with the hardships of servant life. Marriage opportunities for servants are limited by their social status, while potential partners may be restricted to other servants, whose circumstances are equally desperate, and whose prospects for improving family conditions remain minimal. The marriage limitations that affect servants may prevent normal romantic relationships, while reducing opportunities for creating families that could provide emotional support and personal meaning. Friendship development among servants becomes complicated by competition for limited resources, while the stress and desperation that characterize servant life may create conflicts that prevent the solidarity and mutual support that could help servants cope with their shared circumstances. The social tensions that develop among servants may prevent the friendship relationships that could provide emotional relief from the isolation and abuse that define servant existence. Educational opportunities remain completely unavailable to servants, while illiteracy and ignorance are maintained as tools of social control that prevent servants from developing knowledge and skills that might enable them to improve their circumstances or challenge the authority structures that oppress them. The educational deprivation that affects servants ensures that they remain dependent on their superiors, while lacking the intellectual development that could provide alternatives to servant life. Cultural participation becomes impossible for servants who lack access to books, music, art, and other cultural expressions, while the literacy and leisure time necessary for cultural development remain privileges reserved for social superiors. The cultural isolation that affects servants prevents intellectual growth, while denying access to the cultural expressions that provide meaning and identity to other social groups. Information access remains severely limited for servants who depend on their superiors for news and information about the outside world, while the isolation of castle life and servant illiteracy prevent independent access to information that might enable informed decision-making about personal circumstances. The information restrictions that affect servants create dependence on superiors, while preventing the knowledge that might enable servants to understand and improve their situations. Legal knowledge remains unavailable to servants who lack education about their rights and legal protections, while the complexity of legal systems and servant illiteracy prevent understanding of whatever legal protections might exist. The legal ignorance that characterizes servant populations ensures that they cannot advocate for themselves, while remaining vulnerable to exploitation and abuse that might be prevented by legal knowledge. Geographic knowledge about the world beyond castle walls remains limited for servants whose movement is restricted, while lack of education prevents understanding of alternative locations or opportunities that might exist outside their immediate circumstances. The geographic isolation that affects servants creates psychological imprisonment while preventing knowledge about potential alternatives to their current circumstances. Social mobility becomes impossible within castle hierarchies that maintain rigid class distinctions while preventing advancement opportunities that might enable servants to improve their social position through merit, effort, or achievement. The absence of social mobility creates hopelessness while ensuring that servants remain trapped in their subordinate positions, regardless of their individual capabilities or efforts. Community recognition for servant contributions remains non-existent, while the essential work that servants perform receives no acknowledgement or appreciation from the social superiors who benefit from servant labour. The lack of recognition that characterises servant experience creates psychological damage while denying the social validation that humans need for psychological health and self-worth. Personal identity development becomes difficult for servants whose individual characteristics and preferences are ignored, while social identity becomes reduced to functional roles that deny individual humanity and personality. The identity suppression that affects servants prevents normal personality development, while creating psychological damage that affects mental health and social relationships. Social legacy remains impossible for servants whose lives and contributions are not recorded, while the absence of documentation ensures that servant experiences and achievements disappear without historical recognition or remembrance. The social invisibility that characterises servant existence means that their lives leave no trace, while their contributions to castle operations and medieval society remain unacknowledged by historical records. Your economic situation as a castle servant creates a system of debt bondage and financial dependency that makes escape from servant status virtually impossible, while ensuring that your poverty becomes a permanent condition that traps you and your descendants in perpetual servitude. The economic relationships that govern servant life are designed to maintain servant dependency while preventing accumulation of resources that might enable independence or social mobility. Wage systems for servants provide minimal compensation that falls far below subsistence requirements, while creating the illusion of payment that justifies servant obligations without providing adequate resources for survival outside castle service. The wages paid to servants are calculated to maintain dependency rather than enable independence, while ensuring that servants remain economically bound to castle service, regardless of working conditions or treatment quality. Debt accumulation becomes inevitable when servant wages prove inadequate for basic survival needs, while servants must borrow money for food, clothing, medical care, and other essentials that their wages cannot cover. The debt relationships that develop between servants and their employers create additional control mechanisms, while ensuring that servants cannot leave castle service without abandoning debts that they lack resources to repay. Housing costs may be deducted from servant wages, while the substandard accommodations provided to servants are priced at rates that consume significant portions of already inadequate compensation. The housing arrangements that servants must accept often cost more than market rates for comparable accommodations, while providing living conditions that would be unacceptable in normal rental markets. Food costs create additional financial burdens when servants must purchase supplemental nutrition to survive, while the inadequate food provided through castle service fails to meet basic nutritional requirements for maintaining health during physically demanding work. The food expenses that servants incur represent attempts to prevent malnutrition, while consuming resources that might otherwise enable savings or debt reduction. Clothing and equipment costs fall to servants who must purchase work clothes, tools, and personal items, while castle authorities provide minimal equipment that proves inadequate for job requirements. The clothing expenses that servants face include replacing worn-out garments while purchasing specialised items required for specific work tasks that castle management considers servant responsibilities. Medical expenses become catastrophic for servants who lack access to castle medical care, while injuries and illnesses require treatment that servants must finance through personal resources or additional debt. The medical costs that servants face often exceed annual wages while creating debt obligations that ensure permanent economic bondage to castle service. Family support obligations require servants to provide financial assistance to dependent family members, while servant wages prove inadequate for supporting even individual survival needs. The family financial responsibilities that servants bear create additional economic pressure, while ensuring that servant wages remain insufficient for economic independence. Savings opportunities remain non-existent for servants whose wages fall below survival requirements, while any attempt to accumulate resources for future security is prevented by immediate survival needs that consume all available income. The inability to save money ensures that servants remain vulnerable to economic crises while preventing accumulation of resources that might enable escape from servant status. Credit access for servants remains limited to predatory lending arrangements that charge excessive interest rates, while creating debt obligations that exceed servant capacity for repayment. The credit relationships that servants enter often worsen their economic situations, while creating additional financial obligations that increase their dependency on castle service. Economic mobility becomes impossible within systems that maintain servant wages below survival levels, while preventing accumulation of capital that might enable investment in education, tools, or business opportunities that could improve economic circumstances. The economic structure that governs servant life ensures that poverty becomes permanent, while social mobility remains impossible, regardless of individual effort or merit. Business opportunities remain unavailable to servants who lack capital, education, and legal status necessary for entrepreneurship, while castle obligations prevent the time and energy investment that business development requires. The business restrictions that affect servants ensure that they remain dependent on wages, while preventing development of independent income sources that might enable economic freedom. Property ownership becomes impossible for servants who lack resources for purchasing land, buildings, or other assets, while legal restrictions may prevent servant property ownership regardless of financial capacity. The property restrictions that affect servants ensure permanent economic dependency, while preventing wealth accumulation that might enable social mobility. Inheritance opportunities remain minimal for servants whose families possess no significant assets, while the economic conditions that create servant poverty typically persist across generations, ensuring that children of servants inherit poverty rather than resources that might enable better circumstances. The inheritance patterns that affect servant families ensure that poverty becomes hereditary, while preventing intergenerational economic advancement. Investment opportunities remain completely unavailable to servants who lack surplus income for financial investment, while the economic knowledge necessary for wealth building remains inaccessible to servant populations. The investment restrictions that affect servants ensure that they cannot participate in economic activities that might provide returns beyond wages, while preventing accumulation of wealth through financial instruments. Economic security remains impossible for servants whose employment depends entirely on employer satisfaction, while the absence of employment contracts or job security means that servants can be dismissed without notice or compensation. The employment insecurity that characterizes servant positions prevents long-term economic planning, while ensuring that servants remain vulnerable to immediate economic catastrophe through job loss. Retirement planning becomes meaningless for servants whose wages provide no surplus for future security, while the physical demands of servant work ensure that aging servants become unable to maintain productivity levels required for continued employment. The retirement prospects for servants involve poverty and abandonment, while the economic system that exploits their labour provides no support for servants who become unable to work. Economic rights remain non-existent for servants who lack legal protections against wage theft, contract violations, and other economic exploitation, while the power imbalances that characterise servant relationships prevent enforcement of whatever economic protections might theoretically exist. The economic vulnerability that defines servant status ensures that exploitation becomes normal, while servants lack recourse for economic injustices they suffer. Your children's fate as offspring of castle servants is determined before birth by the social hierarchy that governs castle life, ensuring that they inherit your social position along with the poverty, abuse, and limited opportunities that characterise servant existence. The medieval class system creates conditions where children born to servants face predetermined futures of servitude while being denied the education, opportunities, and social mobility that might enable them to escape the circumstances of their birth. Child labour begins early for servant children who are expected to contribute to family survival through work assignments that interfere with normal childhood development, while exposing them to dangerous conditions and adult responsibilities before they possess the physical and mental maturity necessary for such tasks. The work obligations that servant children face include cleaning, carrying, and assisting with adult tasks, while their small size and limited strength make these activities particularly dangerous and damaging to their developing bodies. Educational deprivation affects servant children who receive no formal schooling, while illiteracy and ignorance are maintained as tools of social control that prevent development of knowledge and skills that might enable escape from servant status. The educational restrictions that apply to servant children ensure that they remain dependent on castle authorities, while lacking the intellectual development that could provide alternatives to inherited servant roles. Nutritional deficiency creates lasting developmental problems for servant children whose inadequate diet prevents normal physical and mental growth, while malnutrition during critical developmental periods causes permanent damage to cognitive function and physical capabilities. The nutritional deprivation that affects servant children ensures that they begin life with disadvantages that compound throughout their lifetimes, while making them less capable of challenging the social systems that oppress them. Physical abuse becomes normalised for servant children who witness violence against their parents, while experiencing punishment and mistreatment that teaches them to accept abuse as normal aspects of social relationships. The violence that servant children experience creates psychological damage, while preparing them for lifetimes of submission to authority figures who view them as objects rather than human beings deserving of respect and protection. Sexual exploitation threatens servant children, particularly girls, who may be targeted by castle residents, whose social position provides immunity from consequences, while servant families lack power to protect their children from sexual abuse. The sexual dangers that servant children face create additional trauma, while demonstrating their complete vulnerability within castle social systems that prioritise the desires of powerful individuals over child welfare. Health problems develop early among servant children who live in unsanitary conditions while lacking access to medical care that might prevent or treat childhood diseases and injuries. The health challenges that servant children face include respiratory problems from poor air quality, intestinal diseases from contaminated food and water, and injuries from dangerous living and working conditions that receive no medical attention. Social isolation affects servant children who are excluded from interactions with children of higher social status, while being denied access to games, activities, and social experiences that characterise normal childhood development. These social restrictions that apply to servant children prevent formation of friendships and social skills, while ensuring that they remain isolated within servant communities that lack resources for providing enriching childhood experiences. Psychological development becomes distorted for servant children who grow up in environments characterised by fear, abuse, and hopelessness. while witnessing the systematic dehumanization of their parents and community members. The psychological damage that servant children experience affects their mental health, while creating worldviews that accept oppression and abuse as natural and inevitable aspects of human existence. Future prospects for servant children remain limited to inheriting their parents' social position, while the absence of alternatives ensures that children born into servant families will spend their lives in conditions similar to or worse than those their parents endured. The predetermined futures that await servant children eliminate hope, while ensuring that each generation of servants reproduces the conditions that maintain castle social hierarchies. Family separation may occur when servant children are assigned to different work areas or sold to other households, while economic pressures may force servant families to give up children they cannot support. The family disruptions that affect servant children create additional psychological trauma while destroying the family relationships that might provide emotional support during difficult childhoods. Apprenticeship opportunities remain unavailable to servant children who lack access to skilled trades and professional development, while social restrictions prevent them from learning occupations that might provide better economic prospects. The educational limitations that affect servant children ensure that they remain restricted to unskilled labour while preventing development of expertise that might enable social mobility. Marriage prospects for servant children involve arranged relationships with other servants, while romantic choices remain limited to individuals whose circumstances are equally desperate and whose prospects for improving family conditions remain minimal. The marriage restrictions that affect servant children ensure that they form families that reproduce the poverty and social disadvantages that characterize their parents' circumstances. Property inheritance for servant children typically involves receiving debts and obligations rather than assets, while the economic conditions that create servant poverty ensure that children inherit financial burdens rather than resources that might enable better circumstances. The inheritance patterns that affect servant families ensure that poverty becomes hereditary, while preventing intergenerational wealth accumulation that might enable social advancement. Legal protection for servant children remains minimal or non-existent, while their vulnerability to abuse and exploitation receives no recognition from legal systems that prioritize the rights of property owners over the welfare of servants and their families. The legal vulnerability that affects servant children ensures that they have no recourse for mistreatment, while remaining completely dependent on the goodwill of superiors who view them as expendable resources. Career development becomes impossible for servant children who lack access to education, training, and professional opportunities, while social restrictions ensure that they remain limited to unskilled positions that provide minimal compensation and no advancement prospects. The career limitations that affect servant children ensure that they will spend their lives in poverty while being unable to develop skills or knowledge that might enable better economic circumstances. Cultural development remains unavailable to servant children who lack access to literacy, arts, music, and other cultural expressions, while the time and resources necessary for cultural education are directed toward children of higher social status. The cultural deprivation that affects servant children prevents intellectual and creative development while ensuring that they remain excluded from the cultural life that provides meaning and identity to other social groups. Your experience as a female castle servant involves facing all the hardships that affect male servants, while encountering additional dangers and disadvantages that result from gender-based discrimination and exploitation within medieval social systems that view women as inherently inferior and more vulnerable to abuse. The combination of class oppression and gender discrimination creates conditions where female servants face systematic exploitation that goes beyond the already harsh treatment experienced by their male counterparts, creating layers of suffering that compound daily until your existence becomes a constant struggle against forces designed to destroy both your body and spirit. The medieval worldview that governs castle life treats women as property rather than people, creating legal and social frameworks where female servants exist in a state of permanent vulnerability that extends beyond economic exploitation to include systematic sexual, physical, and psychological abuse that receives not only tolerance, but active encouragement from the power structures that control castle operations. Your identity as a female servant places you at the intersection of class and gender oppression, creating conditions where you face dangers that male servants never encounter while receiving even less protection and support than your already powerless male counterparts. Sexual exploitation becomes a constant threat for female servants, whose vulnerability to rape and sexual abuse increases due to their isolated working conditions and complete lack of legal protection against sexual violence from male castle residents and staff. The sexual dangers that female servants face include assault by castle guards, noble residents, and supervisory personnel whose social position provides immunity from consequences, while female servants lack any mechanism for reporting or seeking justice for sexual crimes committed against them on a daily basis throughout castle corridors where predators operate with complete impunity. The systematic nature of sexual abuse within castle walls creates environments where rape and sexual assault become normalised aspects of female servant experience rather than criminal acts deserving punishment and prevention. Your daily work assignments deliberately place you in isolated locations where sexual predators can assault you without witnesses or interruption, while your sleeping quarters provide no security against nighttime attacks that occur regularly without consequence for perpetrators who view sexual access to female servants as privileges of their social position. The sexual exploitation that female servants endure extends beyond individual acts of violence to include systematic prostitution arrangements, where castle authorities may rent female servants to visiting nobles or use sexual access as rewards for male servants and guards who demonstrate loyalty to castle management. These organised sexual exploitation systems treat female servants as sexual commodities, whose bodies generate revenue for castle operations while creating additional income streams that depend on maintaining female servants in conditions of sexual slavery. The pregnancy that results from systematic sexual abuse creates additional burdens for female servants who must continue working while pregnant despite receiving no prenatal care or accommodation for pregnancy-related health needs. The pregnancies that result from rape and sexual exploitation often end in miscarriage due to continued physical labour and malnutrition, while successful pregnancies create children whose parentage may be unknown, and whose care becomes the sole responsibility of female servants who lack resources for child support. The contraception and reproductive control that might prevent unwanted pregnancies remain completely unavailable to female servants, while the medieval understanding of reproduction places blame for pregnancy entirely on women regardless of the circumstances of conception. The absence of reproductive choice ensures that female servants bear children they cannot support, while facing punishment for pregnancy that results from sexual abuse they could not prevent or resist. Reproductive exploitation affects female servants who may be forced into sexual relationships for the economic benefit of castle authorities, while pregnancy and childbirth occur without adequate medical care or time for recovery from birth-related injuries and complications. The reproductive burdens that female servants bear include continuing physical labour during pregnancy, while lacking nutrition and care necessary for healthy pregnancy outcomes, creating conditions where both maternal and infant mortality rates among servant populations reach catastrophic levels. The forced breeding programs that some castles implement treat female servants as livestock, whose reproductive capacity generates future workers for castle operations, creating systematic rape programs designed to produce children who will inherit their mother's servant status, while providing castle authorities with renewable sources of unpaid labour. These breeding arrangements view female servants as production facilities rather than human beings, while eliminating any reproductive autonomy or family planning that might enable women to control their fertility and family size. The maternal mortality that results from inadequate prenatal care and continued physical labour during pregnancy creates death rates among pregnant servants that exceed those of battlefield casualties, while the medical care that could prevent maternal deaths remains reserved for women whose social status makes their survival important to castle operations. The childbirth process for female servants occurs without skilled medical assistance, while complications that could be easily treated result in death or permanent disability that affects the woman's ability to work and care for her children. The infant mortality among children born to female servants reaches levels that would be considered genocidal if deliberately imposed, while the malnutrition and lack of medical care that affects pregnant servants ensures that children who survive birth often suffer from developmental problems and health conditions that reduce their life expectancy and quality of life. The children born to female servants inherit their mother's social status, while beginning life with health disadvantages that result from inadequate prenatal care and birth conditions. Domestic violence becomes normalised for female servants who may face physical abuse from male servants, supervisors, and castle residents, while the legal and social systems that govern castle life provide no protection or recourse for women who experience intimate partner violence or sexual assault. The domestic violence that female servants experience often goes unreported, while creating additional psychological trauma that affects their ability to perform work duties and maintain mental health in environments where violence against women receives social approval rather than condemnation. The intimate partner violence that female servants experience includes arranged marriages to abusive men whose violence serves castle management interests by maintaining female servant submission and preventing solidarity among servant populations. The marriage arrangements that pair female servants with violent men create permanent domestic abuse situations, while ensuring that female servants face violence in both their work and personal relationships without access to escape or protection. The psychological abuse that accompanies physical violence includes systematic humiliation and degradation designed to destroy female servants' self-esteem and resistance to exploitation. While the public nature of much domestic violence against female servants serves as warnings to other women about the consequences of resistance or disobedience. The psychological warfare that female servants endure creates mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and trauma that affect their ability to function, while receiving no recognition or treatment from authorities who view psychological damage as effective behaviour control. The witnessing of violence against other female servants creates additional psychological trauma, while the requirement to remain silent about abuse creates complicity that compounds guilt and helplessness among female servant populations. The constant exposure to violence against women creates desensitization that affects mental health, while building community trauma that affects entire populations of female servants who live in fear of similar treatment. Economic discrimination ensures that female servants receive lower wages than male servants, while being assigned work that is equally demanding but considered less valuable due to gender-based assumptions about women's capabilities and worth. The economic disadvantages that female servants face include being paid less for comparable work, while lacking opportunities for advancement to higher-paying positions that are reserved for male workers, creating systematic wage discrimination that ensures female servants remain trapped in poverty, regardless of their work quality or productivity levels. The payment systems that govern female servant compensation often involve non-monetary payments, including clothing, food, or shelter, that provide castle authorities with additional control over female servants, while eliminating cash wages that might enable economic independence. The compensation structures for female servants create dependency relationships, while preventing accumulation of resources that might enable escape from abusive situations or investment in alternative economic opportunities. The economic exploitation that female servants face includes unpaid overtime, dangerous work assignments that lack hazard pay, and responsibility for expensive tools and materials that female servants must replace from their own wages when damaged or lost. The economic arrangements that govern female servant employment create systematic theft of wages while imposing costs that reduce already inadequate compensation to levels that cannot support basic survival needs. The financial vulnerability that results from gender-based wage discrimination makes female servants more susceptible to economic exploitation, including debt bondage, forced loans, and financial arrangements that create permanent economic dependency on castle authorities. The economic weakness that affects female servants creates opportunities for additional exploitation, while ensuring that economic pressures can be used to coerce compliance with sexual and physical abuse. Work assignments for female servants often involve the most unpleasant and dangerous tasks, including cleaning latrines, handling diseased materials, and working in areas with high exposure to toxic chemicals and dangerous conditions. The gender-based work assignments ensure that female servants face additional health risks while performing tasks that male servants may refuse or be excused from performing, creating occupational segregation that systematically exposes women to the most hazardous working conditions available within castle operations. The dangerous work that female servants perform includes handling human waste, cleaning areas contaminated with disease, and working with toxic chemicals that cause reproductive damage and cancer while receiving no protective equipment or safety training that might reduce health risks. The occupational hazards that female servants face include respiratory problems from cleaning chemicals, skin damage from caustic substances, and reproductive health problems from exposure to toxic materials during pregnancy. The workplace safety standards that apply to female servants are virtually non-existent, while the assumption that women's work is inherently safer creates conditions where female servants face dangerous working conditions without safety equipment or protective measures that might be provided to male workers in similar situations. The safety discrimination that affects female servants ensures that they suffer higher rates of workplace injury while receiving less compensation and medical care for occupational injuries. The physical demands of female servant work often exceed those faced by male servants, while the expectation that women can perform heavy labour without adequate nutrition or rest creates working conditions that damage health and physical capabilities over time. The work assignments that female servants receive include lifting weights that exceed safe limits, working extended hours without breaks, and performing tasks that require physical strength while operating under conditions of malnutrition and exhaustion. Clothing restrictions for female servants may include requirements to wear garments that interfere with safe work performance, while modesty requirements may prevent access to protective clothing that could reduce injury risks during dangerous tasks. The clothing limitations that affect female servants create additional safety hazards while prioritising appearance and social control over worker safety and comfort, ensuring that female servants perform dangerous tasks while wearing clothing that increases accident risks and injury severity. The uniform requirements that govern female servant dress often include restrictive garments that limit mobility and create hazards during physical labour, while the quality of clothing provided to female servants offers minimal protection against workplace dangers, including cuts, burns, and chemical exposure. The clothing standards for female servants prioritise sexual attractiveness and submission symbols over practical work requirements, while creating appearance standards that interfere with job performance and safety. The footwear provided to female servants offers inadequate protection against workplace hazards, while often consisting of flimsy shoes that provide no support for extended standing and walking on hard surfaces. The foot problems that develop among female servants include injuries from inadequate footwear, while the lack of proper work boots creates additional safety hazards during tasks that involve sharp objects, hot surfaces, and slippery conditions. The seasonal clothing provisions for female servants fail to provide adequate protection against weather extremes, while winter clothing remains inadequate for outdoor work assignments that continue regardless of weather conditions. The inadequate clothing provisions ensure that female servants suffer from cold exposure and weather-related health problems, while performing essential tasks in conditions that male servants might avoid through better equipment access. Healthcare access for female servants remains even more limited than for male servants, while reproductive health needs receive no attention from castle medical resources that focus exclusively on maintaining the health of valuable male workers and castle nobility. The healthcare discrimination that affects female servants ensures that gynecological problems, pregnancy complications, and reproductive health issues receive no treatment, while creating additional suffering and health risks that affect both individual women and their children. The medical neglect that female servants experience includes lack of treatment for injuries that result from sexual assault, domestic violence, and workplace accidents, while the medical care that could prevent permanent disability and death remains unavailable to women whose health is considered unimportant to castle operations. The healthcare rationing that affects female servants ensures that they suffer from preventable diseases while developing chronic health conditions that could be treated with minimal medical intervention. The reproductive health care that female servants need includes prenatal care, birth assistance, and treatment for gynecological problems, while none of these services are provided to servant populations whose reproductive health is considered irrelevant to castle productivity. The absence of reproductive health care creates conditions where female servants suffer from preventable complications, while experiencing maternal and infant mortality rates that reflect deliberate medical neglect rather than lack of medical knowledge. The mental health care that female servants need to address trauma from sexual abuse, domestic violence, and workplace stress remains completely unavailable, while the psychological problems that result from systematic abuse receive no recognition or treatment from medical authorities. The mental health neglect that affects female servants creates additional suffering while preventing recovery from trauma that could be addressed through basic psychological support and intervention. Social mobility opportunities remain completely unavailable to female servants, whose gender prevents access to skilled trades, administrative positions, and other occupations that might provide advancement prospects available to some male servants. The gender restrictions that affect female servants ensure that they remain trapped in the lowest paying and most dangerous positions while having no opportunities for professional development or economic advancement that might enable escape from servant status. The professional exclusions that affect female servants include prohibition from learning skilled trades that might provide better working conditions and economic prospects, while the educational restrictions that prevent female literacy ensure that administrative positions remain unavailable, regardless of individual capabilities. The career limitations that result from gender discrimination ensure that female servants cannot develop expertise or skills that might enable economic independence or social advancement. The mentorship and training opportunities that might enable professional development remain unavailable to female servants, while the assumption that women lack intellectual capacity prevents access to education and skill development that could improve employment prospects. The professional development restrictions that affect female servants ensure that they remain limited to unskilled labour, while being excluded from training programs that might enable career advancement. The networking and professional relationships that support career advancement in other occupations remain unavailable to female servants, whose social isolation prevents formation of professional connections that might provide advancement opportunities. The social restrictions that affect female servants eliminate access to the professional networks that enable career development, while ensuring that women remain isolated and dependent on their current employment situations. Marriage arrangements for female servants may be controlled by castle authorities, who view servant marriages as economic transactions, while female servants may be forced into marriages that benefit castle operations rather than personal preferences or romantic choices. The marriage restrictions that affect female servants eliminate personal autonomy, while creating relationships that may increase rather than reduce their vulnerability to abuse and exploitation, ensuring that marriage becomes another form of control rather than an opportunity for improved circumstances. The arranged marriages that female servants must accept often involve men who have been selected for their willingness to control and abuse their wives rather than provide partnership and support, creating marriage relationships that serve castle management interests in maintaining female servant submission. The marriage arrangements that govern female servant relationships prioritise castle authority over personal compatibility while ensuring that marriage provides no escape from exploitation and abuse. The domestic arrangements that result from controlled marriages include living situations where female servants face increased workloads as they must maintain household responsibilities in addition to castle work obligations while receiving no reduction in work assignments or compensation for additional domestic labour. The marriage arrangements that affect female servants create double burdens, while ensuring that marriage increases rather than reduces their vulnerability to exploitation. The reproductive control that accompanies arranged marriages includes requirements for female servants to produce children according to castle needs, while having no autonomy over family planning decisions that affect their health and economic circumstances. The marriage arrangements that govern female servant reproduction treat women as breeding stock while eliminating personal choice about pregnancy timing and family size. Pregnancy discrimination affects female servants who must continue performing dangerous physical labour while pregnant and may face punishment or dismissal, if pregnancy reduces their work productivity. The pregnancy-related discrimination that female servants experience includes being assigned more dangerous tasks while pregnant as punishment for becoming pregnant and reducing their work capacity, creating conditions where pregnancy becomes a liability rather than a natural life process deserving accommodation and support. The workplace policies that govern pregnant servant employment include no accommodation for pregnancy-related health needs, while continuing to require performance of tasks that endanger both maternal and fetal health. The pregnancy discrimination that pregnant servants face includes assignment to more hazardous work as punishment for becoming pregnant, while facing threats of dismissal if pregnancy affects work performance. The maternity leave policies for female servants are non-existent, while new mothers must return to full work assignments immediately after childbirth, regardless of recovery needs or birth complications that require extended healing time. The postpartum period for female servants includes no rest or recovery time, while the physical demands of servant work continue immediately after childbirth, despite health risks and recovery needs. The breastfeeding accommodations for new mothers remain unavailable, while female servants must work full schedules without breaks for nursing infants who may be left unattended for extended periods. The infant care arrangements for servant children include minimal supervision, while mothers work extended hours without time for childcare responsibilities that compete with work obligations. Childcare responsibilities create additional burdens for female servants who must care for children while maintaining full work schedules that provide no accommodation for parenting duties. The childcare obligations that female servants bear include working while sick children remain unattended, while lack of childcare resources ensures that servant children receive minimal supervision and care during their developmental years, creating conditions where children suffer neglect, while mothers face impossible choices between childcare and work obligations. The childcare arrangements available to female servants include leaving children unattended while working extended hours, or bringing children to dangerous work environments where they face injury risks and exposure to toxic materials. The childcare solutions that female servants develop include leaving children with other servant women who lack time and resources for adequate supervision, while creating informal childcare networks that provide minimal safety and developmental support. The child discipline expectations that govern servant families include harsh punishment for children whose needs interfere with their mother's work obligations, while the stress and exhaustion that affect female servants create family environments where child abuse becomes common due to maternal mental health problems and overwhelming life pressures. The family dynamics that develop in servant households include parent-child relationships strained by poverty and abuse, while children receive inadequate care and attention due to their mother's overwhelming work obligations. The educational opportunities for servant children remain non-existent, while female servants lack time and resources for providing home education that might enable their children to develop skills and knowledge that could improve their future prospects. The educational neglect that affects servant children ensures that they inherit their parents' illiteracy and ignorance, while being prepared only for lives of servant labour similar to their mothers' experiences. Violence prevention resources remain unavailable to female servants who face higher rates of physical and sexual violence, while lacking access to protection services or safe spaces that might provide refuge from abusive situations. The violence that female servants experience often escalates over time, while absence of intervention services ensures that abuse continues until serious injury or death occurs, creating conditions where violence against women becomes normalized and accepted as inevitable aspects of female servant experience. The domestic violence support that female servants need includes safe housing, legal protection, and economic assistance, while none of these resources are available to women whose social status makes their welfare unimportant to castle authorities. The domestic violence that female servants experience receives no intervention, while creating patterns of abuse that affect entire families and communities of servants. The sexual assault prevention and response services that female servants need remain completely unavailable, while the high rates of sexual violence against female servants receive no attention from authorities whose responsibility should include protecting vulnerable populations from predatory behaviour. The sexual assault that female servants experience goes unpunished, while creating trauma and health problems that affect women throughout their lives. The workplace violence that female servants experience includes harassment, assault, and threats, while the dangerous working conditions expose women to additional violence from fellow workers and supervisors who use violence as behaviour control mechanisms. The workplace safety concerns that affect female servants include sexual harassment that creates hostile work environments while preventing normal job performance and career development. Legal vulnerability increases for female servants whose testimony receives less credibility in legal proceedings, while gender-based assumptions about women's reliability and honesty affect their ability to seek justice for crimes committed against them. The legal discrimination that affects female servants ensures that perpetrators of violence against women face minimal consequences, while female victims receive no protection or compensation for injuries they suffer, creating legal systems that enable violence against women while preventing justice for female victims. The court access that female servants need for addressing grievances remains unavailable, while the legal representation that might enable justice is beyond the economic reach of women whose wages cannot support legal expenses. The legal system that governs castle life treats female servant testimony as inherently unreliable, while providing legal protections exclusively to individuals whose social status makes their rights important to social stability. The law enforcement that might protect female servants from violence operates primarily to maintain order among valuable populations, while showing little interest in protecting servant women from abuse that does not threaten castle operations. The police protection that female servants need remains unavailable, while the violence they experience receives no investigation or punishment from authorities whose priorities focus on maintaining castle productivity rather than protecting vulnerable individuals. The legal remedies that might provide compensation for violence and exploitation remain unavailable to female servants who lack legal standing to seek damages, while the court systems that might provide justice are designed to protect the interests of castle authorities rather than servant welfare. The legal vulnerabilities that affect female servants ensure that they have no recourse for injustices while facing legal systems that actively enable their exploitation and abuse. Social isolation affects female servants who may be restricted from social interactions that are permitted to male servants, while gender-based restrictions limit their access to community activities and social support networks that might provide emotional relief from the hardships of servant life. The social restrictions that affect female servants increase their vulnerability while preventing formation of relationships that might provide mutual support and assistance during difficult circumstances, creating isolation that compounds the effects of abuse and exploitation. The social activities that provide emotional support and community connection remain unavailable to female servants whose work schedules eliminate leisure time, while social restrictions prevent participation in community events that might provide relief from daily hardships. The social isolation that female servants experience includes exclusion from religious activities, community celebrations, and informal social gatherings that provide psychological support to other community members. The friendship opportunities that might provide emotional support remain limited for female servants, whose exhaustion and competing obligations prevent formation of relationships that require time and emotional investment. The social relationships that female servants develop often involve competition for scarce resources, while the stress and desperation that characterize servant life create conflicts that prevent solidarity and mutual support among women who share similar circumstances. The community support networks that might provide assistance during crises remain unavailable to female servants whose social isolation prevents access to mutual aid systems that help other community members during emergencies. The social isolation that affects female servants ensures that they face crises alone, while lacking the community support that might enable survival during particularly difficult periods. Economic dependence becomes more severe for female servants whose lower wages and limited advancement opportunities create greater financial vulnerability, while the absence of alternative economic options ensures that they remain trapped in servant positions regardless of abuse and exploitation they experience. The economic dependence that affects female servants makes escape from abusive situations impossible, while ensuring that they must endure whatever treatment they receive in order to survive, creating economic coercion that enables continued exploitation and abuse. The financial vulnerability that female servants experience includes inability to accumulate savings that might enable escape from abusive situations, while the lower wages that women receive ensure that they remain economically dependent on employment situations that may include systematic abuse and exploitation. The economic powerlessness that affects female servants creates additional leverage for abusers, while preventing women from developing economic independence that might enable escape from dangerous situations. The economic alternatives that might provide escape routes from abusive employment remain unavailable to female servants whose gender excludes them from most occupations, while the educational restrictions that affect women prevent development of skills that might enable economic independence. The economic limitations that affect female servants ensure that they remain trapped in abusive situations, while lacking alternatives that might provide safety and economic security. The economic support that female servants need during crises remains unavailable, while the absence of social safety nets ensures that women face economic catastrophe when employment situations become too dangerous to continue. The economic vulnerability that characterizes female servant existence creates additional coercion, while ensuring that women must accept whatever conditions employers impose in order to avoid economic collapse and potential death. Career limitations for female servants extend beyond class restrictions to include gender-based barriers that prevent access to any occupation that might provide better working conditions or economic prospects. The career restrictions that affect female servants ensure that they remain limited to domestic service positions, while being excluded from skilled trades, administrative work and other occupations that might enable economic independence, creating permanent career limitations that ensure women remain trapped in the most exploitative and dangerous forms of employment available in medieval society. The professional development opportunities that might enable career advancement remain completely unavailable to female servants, while the training and education that could improve employment prospects are prohibited based on gender assumptions about women's intellectual capacity and appropriate social roles. The career limitations that affect female servants ensure that they cannot develop expertise or professional qualifications that might enable escape from domestic service positions. The entrepreneurial opportunities that might provide economic independence remain unavailable to female servants who lack capital, legal rights, and social permission to engage in business activities, while the gender restrictions that govern medieval commerce exclude women from most commercial activities that might provide economic advancement. The business restrictions that affect female servants ensure that they remain economically dependent on wages while being prevented from developing independent sources of income. The occupational mobility that might enable transition to better employment remains impossible for female servants whose gender creates permanent barriers to career advancement, while the social restrictions that govern women's work ensure that domestic service becomes a permanent condition rather than temporary employment that might lead to better opportunities. The career trap that affects female servants ensures that they begin and end their working lives in positions that provide minimal compensation, while offering no prospects for advancement or improvement. Your inevitable death as a castle servant will occur with the same indifference that characterized your life, as castle authorities view servant mortality as a minor inconvenience that requires replacement labour rather than a human tragedy worthy of grief or commemoration. The circumstances surrounding servant death reflect the systematic dehumanisation that defines servant existence, while demonstrating how thoroughly the castle hierarchy prioritises property and productivity over human life and dignity. The causes of servant death typically involve combinations of malnutrition, disease, injury and exhaustion that result from the accumulated effects of harsh working conditions and inadequate care rather than dramatic accidents or acute illnesses that might attract attention to dangerous working conditions. Your death will likely occur slowly through organ failure, infection, or physical collapse that develops over months or years of declining health, while receiving no medical attention that might prevent or delay fatal outcomes. Workplace fatalities among servants receive minimal investigation, while deaths from accidents, toxic exposure, or dangerous working conditions are attributed to servant carelessness rather than inadequate safety measures or dangerous job assignments that exceed human capabilities. The workplace deaths that occur regularly among servant populations are dismissed as inevitable costs of castle operations, while providing no motivation for improving working conditions that might prevent future fatalities. Disease mortality affects servants disproportionately due to their weakened physical condition and exposure to contaminated environments, while epidemic diseases spread rapidly through servant quarters that lack adequate sanitation and medical care. The disease outbreaks that kill servants regularly are viewed as natural disasters rather than preventable public health problems that could be addressed through improved living conditions and medical attention. Starvation deaths may occur during periods of food scarcity when servant rations are reduced to preserve food for castle nobility, while the gradual weakening and death that results from malnutrition receives no intervention from castle authorities who prioritise resource conservation over servant survival. The starvation that kills servants during difficult periods is considered an acceptable sacrifice that maintains food security for valuable individuals whose lives matter to castle operations. Violence-related deaths among servants include murders, fatal beatings, and deaths resulting from sexual assault, while the perpetrators of violence against servants face no legal consequences due to the social and legal systems that deny servant humanity and rights. The violent deaths that affect servants are often covered up or ignored, while creating no motivation for protecting servant safety or punishing individuals who kill servants. Suicide among servants may result from the psychological trauma and hopelessness that characterize servant life, while the mental health problems that drive servants to self-harm receive no recognition or treatment from castle authorities, whose concern focuses exclusively on maintaining productivity. The suicides that occur among servant populations are viewed as evidence of weak character, rather than systemic problems that could be addressed through improved working conditions and humane treatment. Medical neglect causes preventable deaths when servants develop treatable conditions that receive no medical attention, while the healthcare resources that could save servant lives are reserved for individuals whose social status makes their survival important to castle operations. The medical neglect that kills servants demonstrates the calculated decision to allow servant deaths rather than invest in medical care that might preserve servant lives. Death notification for servants involves informing castle management about the loss of a worker rather than grieving the death of a human being, while family members may not be notified about servant deaths that occur away from family communities. The death notification process treats servant mortality as administrative matters rather than human tragedies, while demonstrating the social invisibility that characterises servant existence. Body disposal for servants follows procedures designed to minimise cost and effort, rather than provide dignified burial that honours the deceased, while servant bodies may be disposed of in mass graves or locations that reflect their low social status. The burial practices for servants often involve minimal ceremony and cheap materials, while family members may be prevented from participating in funeral arrangements for deceased relatives. Property inheritance from deceased servants typically involves castle authorities claiming whatever possessions the servant accumulated, while family members receive minimal compensation or inheritance that reflects the servant's economic circumstances. The inheritance procedures for servant estates ensure that castle authorities recover any debts or obligations, while servant families inherit poverty, rather than resources that might improve their circumstances. Replacement procedures begin immediately after servant deaths, while new workers are recruited to fill positions left vacant by deceased servants, without acknowledging the individual who previously performed these duties. The replacement process treats servants as interchangeable units, rather than individuals whose death represents a loss of experience, knowledge, and human relationships that cannot be easily replaced. Record keeping for servant deaths may be minimal or non-existent, while the deaths of servants who spend their lives serving castle operations leave no historical trace that acknowledges their contributions or preserves their memory. The absence of records about servant mortality ensures that their lives and deaths remain invisible to historical documentation, while preventing acknowledgement of the human costs of castle operations. Family impact of servant deaths creates additional hardship for surviving family members who lose income and support while inheriting debts and obligations that the deceased servant accumulated during their service. The family consequences of servant deaths often include poverty and homelessness for surviving spouses and children, while the support systems that might help surviving family members remain unavailable or inadequate. Memorial practices for deceased servants may be prohibited or discouraged, while castle authorities prevent gatherings or ceremonies that might acknowledge servant contributions or create solidarity among surviving servants. The memorial restrictions that affect servant deaths prevent community grieving, while ensuring that servant deaths receive no recognition that might challenge the social hierarchies that caused their suffering. Economic impact of servant deaths on castle operations focuses on productivity losses rather than human tragedy, while the cost calculations surrounding servant mortality emphasize replacement expenses rather than the value of human life that was lost. The economic analysis of servant deaths treats human beings as capital assets, while demonstrating the dehumanization that characterizes castle attitudes towards servant welfare. Community response to servant deaths may be muted by fear and despair, while surviving servants may be prohibited from mourning or acknowledging the deaths of their colleagues and family members. The community reactions to servant mortality are controlled and suppressed while preventing the social recognition and mutual support that might help communities cope with loss and trauma. Legacy preservation for deceased servants remains impossible, while their contributions to castle operations and medieval society disappear without acknowledgement or historical documentation that might preserve their memory for future generations. The absence of legacy preservation ensures that servant lives leave no trace, while their suffering and contributions remain invisible to historical understanding of medieval society. Prevention of servant deaths receives no consideration from castle authorities, whose policies and practices create the conditions that ensure servant mortality, while implementing no reforms that might reduce death rates among servant populations. The prevention opportunities that could save servant lives are ignored, while maintaining systems that treat servant death as acceptable costs of maintaining castle operations and social hierarchies. Statistical tracking of servant mortality does not occur while the patterns and causes of servant deaths remain undocumented, preventing recognition of systemic problems that could be addressed through policy changes or improved working conditions. The absence of mortality data ensures that servant deaths remain invisible, while preventing accountability for the conditions that cause preventable deaths among servant populations. Justice considerations for servant deaths focus on replacing lost productivity rather than investigating causes or holding responsible parties accountable for conditions that contributed to servant mortality. The justice systems that might address servant deaths are designed to protect castle authorities rather than servant welfare, while ensuring that those responsible for servant suffering face no consequences for their actions. Statistical tracking of servant mortality does not occur while the patterns and causes of servant deaths remain undocumented, preventing recognition of systemic problems that could be addressed through policy changes or improved working conditions. The absence of mortality data ensures that servant deaths remain invisible, while preventing accountability for the conditions that cause preventable deaths among servant populations. Prevention of servant deaths receives no consideration from castle authorities, whose policies and practices create the conditions that ensure servant mortality, while implementing no reforms that might reduce death rates among servant populations. The prevention opportunities that could save servant lives are ignored, while maintaining systems that treat servant death as acceptable costs of maintaining castle operations and social hierarchies. Social impact of servant deaths on castle communities creates cycles of trauma and despair, while surviving servants witness the systematic elimination of their colleagues and family members without any intervention or support that might address the psychological damage caused by constant exposure to preventable mortality. The social consequences of servant deaths include community breakdown and loss of hope, while creating conditions where surviving servants accept death as inevitable rather than preventable. Historical documentation of servant deaths remains minimal, while the lives and contributions of servants who built and maintained medieval castles disappear from historical records that focus exclusively on the activities of castle nobility. The historical invisibility of servant mortality ensures that their suffering remains unknown to future generations, while preventing recognition of the human costs of medieval social systems. Accountability systems for servant deaths do not exist, while castle authorities face no consequences for policies and practices that cause servant mortality, creating institutional structures that enable systematic killing of servant populations through neglect and abuse. The absence of accountability ensures that servant deaths continue indefinitely, while those responsible for servant welfare face no pressure to implement reforms that might save lives. The reality of servant death in medieval castles represents the logical conclusion of social systems that view human beings as property, while treating servant mortality as acceptable costs of maintaining aristocratic comfort and privilege. The deaths that servants face represent not tragic accidents, but predictable outcomes of social hierarchies that prioritise some human lives over others, while systematically destroying those deemed expendable. As the castle bells toll another evening and the shadows lengthen across the stone walls that have witnessed centuries of human suffering, let your mind rest on this sobering truth. You've just experienced life as one of history's forgotten masses, the servants whose backs built medieval civilization while their names disappeared into unmarked graves. You've walked through corridors where magnificence was built on misery, where every tapestry was hung by hands that would never own beautiful things, where every feast was prepared by people who subsisted on scraps and slept on straw. The romantic castles that capture our imagination today were monuments to human inequality, where your social position at birth determined whether you would live in comfort or die in obscurity. Medieval castle life for the poor wasn't about chivalry and honour. It was about surviving in a system that viewed human beings as property, where your worth was measured by your productivity, and your death was noted only as an inconvenience requiring replacement labour. You've experienced a world where children inherited bondage, where women faced additional layers of exploitation, and where old age meant abandonment rather than respect. But perhaps most sobering is the realization that these weren't exceptional circumstances, but the normal reality for the vast majority of people who lived in medieval castles. While we admire the architecture and romanticize the period, we're looking at structures built entirely on human suffering, where every stone was lifted by people whose lives were considered expendable. The servants who made castle life possible, who hauled water up countless stairs, who cleaned waste from latrines, who worked until their bodies broke down, left no written records of their experiences. Their stories survive only in the negative space of history, visible through the systems designed to exploit them and the mechanisms created to keep them powerless. Understanding their reality helps us appreciate how revolutionary concepts like workers' rights, social mobility, and human dignity truly are. The idea that all people deserve basic respect, adequate food, safe working conditions, and opportunities for advancement would have been incomprehensible to the castle lords who built their comfort on servant suffering. So as you drift towards sleep in your heated home, perhaps feeling grateful for labour laws, minimum wages, and the concept that work should provide dignity rather than degradation, remember the millions who lived and died in castle shadows. Their suffering was not inevitable. It was the result of human choices about how societies should be organised and who deserves to benefit from collective human effort. The magnificent castles that still dot the European landscape stand as monuments not just to medieval engineering, but to a social system that treated human beings as raw materials for aristocratic comfort. Every tourist who admires these structures today walks through spaces where people lived, worked, and died in conditions that we would now consider criminal. Tonight, as you rest in comfort that medieval servants could never have imagined, remember that the progress we take for granted was built on recognition that the castle model, where some live in luxury while others suffer in service, represents a fundamental betrayal of human potential and dignity. Sleep well, knowing that your tomorrow will bring opportunities for growth, choices about your future, and the basic human dignity that medieval servants died without ever experiencing. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be everything that medieval castle servants never had. Peaceful, safe, and promising of a better tomorrow.